junkyard jewels, hidden in trash, forgotten too long until found at last. Junkyard jewel with so much inside, hidden from the rest as a matter of pride.
How that blueprint helps us do our work. And then we have some things in the pipeline, some things I haven't even been able to share with anyone yet. So I wanted to share with all of you future projects happening at the center, and then we'll have lots of time for questions at the end. So yes, I am from Alaska. I was not born there, but I was raised there from when I was about 3 all the way until I was 18. I grew up in a tiny Athabascan village right in the middle of the state called McGrath. It's right here. It's a 300-person village, and it is 100% off the road system. You can't drive to this village. The only way in and out was either by barge all the way down here by Bethel, taking the barge up to McGrath, or by taking an airplane. And about 6 months out of the year, it was too cold for those airplanes to fly. And so you just live there. I got around on snow machine and by sled dog. Both my parents are biologists with Fish and Wildlife Service. My dad retired a few years ago. My mom is still actively working. She's a field biologist and an ornithologist. Just to give you an idea of the size of the village I grew up in, you can see that the landing strip is pretty much 3 times the size of the actual footprint of the village. We did have a teeny tiny airstrip that helped us get supplies in and out. And then the village itself was just dotted with a few homes. We had a very, very tiny grocery store with just the bare essentials. My mom would fly from McGrath to Anchorage twice a year, go to Costco and get 6 months worth of groceries, and then either barge or fly those back for us. So we had 2 or 3 large freezers. Everything got frozen, from bread to potato chips to cheese. I didn't grow up eating beef. I grew up eating moose meat. My dad would get 1 moose a year, which is what sustained the whole family, myself and my 2 siblings and our sled dogs. And this is the Kuskokwim River on the left side. We would also string out a fishing net and we would catch salmon to supplement our freezers. So I grew up off the grid and very, very nature child. I've been a birder as long as I can remember. I have the very earliest memories of birding with my mom in Alaska, and it's something that's stuck with me. I was definitely a rough kid. My mom will tell you I wasn't, but she's just being nice. I was a pretty rough teenager, and when I say that nature and birding saved my life, that's not an exaggeration. Even though I grew up with 2 biologist parents, I fought and kicked and screamed and swore I would never end up in conservation. And when I left Alaska to go to college, I was hell-bent on being a poet. And I flew to Wisconsin and I spent 5 years, almost 6 years, trying to graduate from college, studying poetry. Turns out it's really hard to make a living as a poet. And I fell into environmental education. And that was my footstep in the door back into conservation. That was my first job out of college, was doing environmental education. I taught at a high school for a while in special education. When I was back in Alaska, I became a volunteer firefighter. And then I met a boy and ended up in California and got the job with Audubon. I've now been with Audubon for 7 years. And as I said, I'm the center director there, and I have a pair of lovely staff that I want to share with you. The history of the Audubon Center, what we're known for is our water bird conservation. Our 10-acre parcel of land sits adjacent to Richardson Bay, which is a 900-acre subtidal water bird habitat. The center is open year-round, minus holidays and weekends, but we do close the water portion, and I'll show you some pictures of that, 6 months out of the year for the wintering water birds. All the breeding sea ducks come down from Alaska, and they rest right in Richardson Bay. And for 6 months out of the year, mostly in December, January, on a good day, you can look out on the water and not only see terns like this, but 20,000 sea ducks resting and foraging and starting to pair off and find those mates. Now, keep this photo in mind because Richardson Bay was almost a very different place. This was a drawing from a architectural firm that was done in 1957. And this is the exact same viewpoint as this photo right here. And what this firm wanted to do was scrape the hillsides of Richardson Bay. So off on the left here is Tiburon. Off on the right, you have Sausalito. There were hillsides on both sides. They wanted to scrape those and build Reedsport. So this is a drawing of a community that would have had hundreds of homes. Everybody would have had their own marina. And this is the exact footprint that those 20,000 sea ducks rest on now. What happened is the folks that lived over here in Sausalito and Strawberry and the very early bits of Tiburon started to buy up all these subtitle parcels of land. They banded together, got all their neighbors, everybody pitched in, Audubon pitched in, thousands and thousands of dollars, and bought 900 acres to keep the developers from building there. So luckily, this never became a reality. This is one of my favorite photos. It's a little bit grainy, but this is the footprint of the land portion of the center. This landmark right here is called Lyford House, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a moment. This is Rosie's cottage, where a woman named Rosie lived. And Rosie was a lover of goats and birds and environmental education. And she lived on this 10-acre parcel adjacent to the 900 acres. And before she passed away, deeded it to Audubon. And that's where the center sits now. And this was in 1957. This photo right here, this man right there, this is Dr. Lyford. He's the owner of that beautiful Victorian, which I'll show you some restored photos in a moment. Dr. Lyford made his fame and fortune during the Civil War. He invented a new way of embalming people. So he became a very, very wealthy man, left the war, started a dairy farm right inside that Lyford house. And when Dr. Lyford's brother came to visit him once, his brother fell in love with the woman on the left, and that's Rosie. Now, there was a problem with this. Rosie was Portuguese, and she was also the daughter of the help, so she was poor. And so the two people were forbidden from being with one another. And when the man died, instead of leaving Lyford House and the land to his wife, he actually left it to Rosie. And that photo on the right is Rosie many, many years later. People in Tiburon still remember her for her love of goats and her love of birds. And she would literally walk her goats from the porch of Lyford House into downtown Tiburon. And Rosie lived the remainder of her life right on the Audubon property. This is what we look like today. So that you can see Lyford House. It's been beautifully restored. The house itself was built in 1857. This is Richardson Bay off to the side here. And the house sits on, as I said, about 10 acres of land. My office is just to the right. And we have an on-site Montessori preschool that rents one of our buildings and helps us with our earned income. So it's a great partnership for my budget. And it's also a window of getting 2- and 3-year-olds onto the property. And they tend to stay until they're 18, which is amazing. So at the Audubon Center, I'm very lucky to have 2 incredible staff. I have 2 young people that work for me. On the right, that is Hamar. On the left, that is Paige. Hamar is my community engagement coordinator, and Hamar is in charge of all the things that I used to be when I started in Hamar's position. So Hamar gets to have all the fun now, running our youth engagement, engaging with our volunteers, and hanging out with our biologists. That's Paige on the left. She's our resident biologist. I was able to snatch Paige from Alcatraz Island after an internship she did with the Park Service. And she is indeed one of the best hires I've ever made. These 2 are my boots on the ground warriors. You can see Paige up in our boat in the top corner, getting ready to set the buoys for the annual waterbird closure. We have about 15 of those buoys. They weigh about 40 pounds each, and they've got a cinder block attached to the bottom. And between the 3 of us, we throw those out and mark the boundary of our 900-acre sanctuary to keep folks out. So for the 6 months, we don't allow boats, kayakers, paddleboarders, swimmers, You cannot go in that water once the birds are there. And it's a full-time job for those 6 months just to keep folks out of the water. We're very lucky in that most of our neighbors are very understanding, and it's usually new residents that just need a little bit of a reminder to stay out during the annual closure. This is a raft of mostly scaup. You can see some ruddies tucked in there, and I think a random goose in the left-hand corner there. This is just a snippet of what the bay looks like on a really beautiful winter day. As I said, we can get 20,000 sea ducks, and the longer you look, the more you see just resting on the water. And this is the reason we close it for 6 months out of the year. The Richardson Bay area is one of the only stopovers for these wintering water birds. And if it weren't there, if it had been Reedsport, like in a photo a little bit ago, these ducks would literally have nowhere to land. And we'll get into more of the reasons that they land here a little bit for the fact that we close it. But there's also some really incredible resources that you can only find in a handful of places up and down the Pacific Flyway. One of those resources is eelgrass. When I moved to California, this was a new plant for me. We don't have a lot of aquatic grass type vegetation like this in Alaska. So this was a new habitat structure for me to learn. It's like seaweed is the best way I can describe it. And it's this really vibrant, thin, grassy meadow that is a nursery for things like small fish and crabs, but it's also a vital food source for those wintering water birds. The reason it's so important is just before the water birds migrate down from Alaska, the Pacific herring, a small silver fish, show up in the bay, and the eelgrass happens to be the perfect place for them to lay their eggs. So underneath all of that beautiful herring roe is eelgrass, and this is a really nutritious meal for a sea duck. This will give them all the fat storage they need. They can dine on this for literally 6 months so that they're nice and plump and ready to head back to their breed in Alaska. So in December, January, our shorelines literally wash up with all these clumps of herring roe. And if you time it just right, if anybody comes to visit us this winter, you can actually catch what we call a feeding frenzy. And that's when the Pacific herring spawn in the water. All the ducks know that it's happened, and it becomes this glorious frenzy of cormorants and sea ducks and gulls and terns diving into the water, gobbling up that freshly laid roe. And it's just incredible. It sounds like little semi trucks zipping around the bay. You can literally hear the wing beats of 20,000 birds, and it's almost deafening. So you can start to understand that eelgrass is really this vital piece of habitat in Richardson Bay. Just to orient you to this map a little bit, the center is up in this corner over here. You can't quite see it. And this is an eelgrass bed right here. The darker the green, the more eelgrass, the lighter the green, the less eelgrass. One of the things that we started to notice is our water bird populations from our annual counts were declining. And we wanted to know why. Every winter for probably the past 20 years, we've counted the sea ducks as they come, and we started to see less and less. And we started to see less and less eelgrass washing up on shore with the roe. So we wanted to understand why. What we did is we hired a company to fly over the bay and take these aerial images of the eelgrass at a low tide. And one, they helped us determine exactly how much eelgrass was out in Richardson Bay. And in 2019, that was about 840 acres. So that's all the green that you see. The majority of it was off Sausalito, but you can see it does tip into our 900-acre sanctuary. Our sanctuary extends pretty much down here to the tip of Belvedere and then back up. So we've got about half the eelgrass bed in our sanctuary waters. This is where the human dynamic and the bird dynamic clash. One of the things that we noticed is there were a bunch of boats that were illegally mooring in the eelgrass. So they were taking their anchors from their boats, dropping them in the eelgrass, and they were folks that were living on the bay. Well, every time they dropped an anchor, it would rip up eelgrass. Every time they would spin with the tide or the wind, it would create something called crop circles. And we determined that over the course of many years, about 84 acres of eelgrass had been damaged, and that's a ton. And for every single boat that was illegally anchored on this water, they were doing about half an acre of damage per vessel. This is what the anchorage looks like sometimes. Every one of these boats is illegally moored. It's a really tough issue, and it's one that has been really hard for me personally and professionally. I care about the birds and the eelgrass deeply. This is where it gets complicated, is all the folks that live out here, they're homeless. They have nowhere else to go. So it becomes this really tough anchor point of what do you do? You know, how do you balance all of the things that are happening? But when we got those images, this is what we were seeing. You can see those anchor out scars. You can see that for every boat, those crop circles are killing eelgrass. And this is why it's important we do eelgrass conservation and restoration. You can see this is an illegally moored boat right here, and this is a herring spawn with thousands of sea ducks diving right next to it. So what Audubon is doing is we wanted to be part of the solution. We are continuing to map eelgrass, count water birds, that we have all that good data to back ourselves up. But we are also using our boat to bring social services workers out on our own time to the folks that are living on these boats to get them the resources they need to get them off the water. And so we are providing kind of all angles of this work, from the human side to the conservation side to the bird side. And that's something all my two staff and I do on a daily basis. So shifting gears a little bit away from eelgrass, we're going to kind of zoom in on the center a little bit. This is one of my babies. This is Aramburu Island. This is a dredge spoil island. It's about 17 acres and it's right near the center. This dredge spoil island became critically important in 2007. If y'all remember the Casco Busan oil spill, when that oil tanker hit the Bay Bridge, the oil leaked into the greater San Francisco Bay, and many of the sea ducks that had just gotten here from Alaska were contaminated. They all washed up right here, which is just within eyesight of the center. Now, as a dredge spoil island, it didn't look like this. It was just the mud and the muck from the channel right down here that had been dredged for all the homes that are here and the docks. Audubon saw this as a critical opportunity to turn this island into suitable bird habitat. This is the center right here. Here's the 10-acre parcel that the center of my office sits in. Here's Aramburu Island. We could literally kayak to the island from our office. So from 2007 to 2011, we did a ton of paperwork and we got mitigation money from that oil spill to start to restore Aramburu Island. And it was all done by hand and literally hundreds of thousands of volunteer hours. All the invasives were hand pulled. There were no chemicals used. Native plants were grown at the center and then hauled out via kayak and then hand planted by volunteers. And so now Aramburu, instead of being basically a dredge spoil muddy island, I'm going to just go back, has this beautiful habitat footprint. We have a coastal live oak grove here. We have a little tidal marsh here. This, during the rainy season, becomes a shorebird pan. This is perfect tern breeding habitat, which I'll talk more about in a moment. We have a pair of black oyster catchers that nest over here now. And this has become the success story for the Bay Area, and how not only to do a restoration project, but how to do a living shoreline. And what I mean by that is all this gravel and sand and rock was brought in so that the tidal action will naturally move it back and forth, and it becomes this natural landscape that's perfect for birds to nest on. And I have to do bird photos every so often. This is one of the reasons we do it. This is one of my favorite birds. I absolutely love terns. And with those restored shorelines, on a good day during tern season, we will see hundreds and hundreds of terns resting on that shoreline. And this is the other reason we do it. This is our resident pair of black oyster catchers. There's really only a handful that nest in the entire Bay Area. The oil spill happened in 2007. We finished construction in 2011. And by the spring of 2011, our first pair of black oyster catchers nested. And every year since, we've had black oyster catcher chicks. They haven't all made it, but we have a very successful, dedicated pair that try and nest every year since 2011. So Aramburu Island, you know, as I said, it's a small restoration project. It's 17 acres. A lot of it's done by hand and volunteers. My staff and I are also involved in large-scale restoration projects. So this is a snapshot that was just taken this year. This was taken at Sonoma Creek, which is on Highway 37 in between the East Bay and Tiburon. So it's right along a really beautiful corridor that a ton of water birds and shorebirds use. It's bordered by Sonoma Land Trust land, as well as the San Pablo Bay National Wildlife Refuge. This is a plant called pickleweed, and it's a vital component of any habitat restoration project. So we've brought some pickleweed in, we've restored some of the areas that had native pickleweed. This is one of my favorite photos of my two staff. This is Paige, the biologist, in the yellow, and Hamar on the right. Now that behind them is a huge crane that is used to dig channels. But in order for that crane to move across that habitat, they have to be very careful of a particular animal, and it's the salt harvest mouse. It's an endangered mouse species that's found in this area, and it's illegal to harm them for all the right reasons. And so what this group of people are doing right here is for 10 hours a day, for 2 weeks at a time, they are literally walking in front of this crane using brushes to sweep the pickleweed back and forth to scare the mice away so we can build the channels for the mice to move back in. So this is one of the hardest fieldwork things to do, because 10 hours a day, you're literally taking a brush in very dense habitat and you're sinking, as you can see, up to your knees in the marshy habitat. So being a biologist isn't always that glamorous. So to give you an idea, this is one of my favorite before and afters. This is what, on the left, what Sonoma Creek looked like right when we built the channel. We used that excavator. You can actually see it all the way in the background to create these channels so that the marsh will naturally drain. This is a year later. And so nature just does her thing when she has the right channels and tools in place. And this is one of the largest restoration projects that Audubon's ever been a part of. This is 400 acres of tidal marsh. And because we need lots of cute bird photos, here's a reason why we do that at Sonoma Creek. You can see this is an endangered ridge-raised rail, and she's got 2 chicks with her, and this was taken at Sonoma Creek. All right, so shifting gears a little bit, you know, we've talked about eelgrass, we've talked about restoration. This is my passion area. So as I said, I was a bit of a rough and tumbly teenager. So I really appreciate the differences that nature can make in people's lives. And so engagement is a huge pillar of the work that we do at the center. And we start all the way with the littles. This was taken just this summer. This was during our summer camp season, and we run a fully inclusive summer camp at our center. And so what that means for us is there are kids of all abilities that are welcome, and they are fully integrated into everything that we do. You can see I've got a naturalist sitting right here, and this is one of the small pods of kiddos that got to explore the center. They have access to the whole property as well as the water's edge for 8 weeks during the summer. These are some teens from our Audubon Youth Leaders program. We recruit exclusively from alternative high schools and work closely with parole officers to bring kids in to learn about conservation. These are kids that haven't really had an opportunity to do internships. And one of the interesting things about Marin County, where the center is located, is teens are required to have an internship in order to graduate high school. And if you're a bit rough around the edges, or maybe, you know, you got in a fight at school and you have a record, intern places don't take you. And so we take them. This is last year's cohort of teens hiking on Ring Mountain with Hamar, and it's really important work. Some of these teens have gone on to work for me. Many of the teens have gone on to study science in college and community college when they were not college bound before. So it's just such a pivotal program. And I'm really proud of the work that we do, and we put them to work. They help us with our habitat restoration. They work in our native plant nursery, which is tucked in the back corner. They get to go hiking, they go camping, they go kayaking, a lot of times for the first time in their entire lives. And it can be this really transformational experience for teenagers. All right, so shifting gears a little bit, the footprint of the center is, like I said, about 10 acres. It's not that big. And as far as the footprint of usable space, we don't have that much. It's a very wild and natural place on the land portion. One of the dreams I had when I started at the center was to create a demonstration garden so that when folks walked into the property, they could see the benefits of native plants in a real landscape, walk up to our nursery, purchase those plants, and bring them home. And COVID really kind of put a slowdown on this project, but this was taken just last week, and you can see that we've started to get our trails laid. And this is what we're going to be building. It's going to be this really great demonstration garden with trails, sensory experiences, a pollinator garden, space for monarchs. This is the bay right here in Lyford House. So this whole experience is going to be about 2 acres. So give me another 6 months and you'll have something really, really beautiful to come see. This is our native plant nursery. It's just tucked up on our hillside. We gather seeds on the property and plant them in our own nursery, and then they end up right back at the center. So this is a small yet working nursery, and my biologist is in charge of all this. This grass right over here, this is carex. This will eventually go out to Aramburu Island. All right, I'm going to take a little bit of a pause. We have been focusing very much on the footprint of the center. I want to think broader. The center work is important. It's the stuff that gets me out of bed. But there are bigger things that we're trying to do rather than just be a center. So what we did is we wrote a blueprint, and it really is helping us guide the work and the decisions that we make for what are we going to do next? What's our next project? This is meant to be a living document that's combining the best science that Audubon has with the best practices of restoration and community engagement. And as I said, it's really helping us guide every project that we choose next. And one of the ways it's doing that is through a really innovative mapping program. We're using GIS to combine different layers of data. We want to know, where is bird habitat that needs to be restored? Does it happen to be next to a community? And does it have a priority landscape for Audubon? And these are some areas that we're hoping to target next. It checks all of those boxes. And this is just another way of looking at it. These are the priority birds that we focus on in Audubon, California, in the center. These are the priority habitats. And we want to work with vulnerable communities. We want to bring them in and give these projects to them and help them do the restoration with us. And so this is how I make the decisions for where I'm going to go next. This is what that mapping looks like. You can see it takes the priority rank from the highest priority, which is red, to green, to blue. And this helps me decide, as I said. And so I live in Vallejo, so I was really happy when the mapping program showed that I have some really important areas that combine all of those things: a socially vulnerable community, a priority habitat, and a priority bird species. And so this is down the road for us. But a blueprint is really only as good as the project that you apply it to. So this is what I've been doing for the last couple of years. Just to orient you a little bit, this is Highway 101. If you were to go to the right, you would end up in San Francisco. If you were to go to the left, you'd pass by the center as you were heading towards Novato and Petaluma. This right here is a retention pond that has been severely neglected from years of mismanagement from a local landowner. There's a shopping complex just to the right. The community that sits behind this retention pond and wetland wants to see it restored. It's a low-income community. It's mostly a Black and Latino community, and they want to help with the design process, but they've been left out of the decision-making process. They don't get invited to the meetings to help decide what this wetland could be. That's where Audubon's trying to make things different. You can see this wetland is in an incredibly urban area. You have this huge shopping center to the right. This is a low-income HUD housing community all around it. And as I said, this is the Highway 101. And so what Audubon's trying to do is, of course, restore this habitat for water birds. We would love to see ducks using that when they fly down. Our center is just 4 miles from here. But we're also meeting with the residents, trying to hear what they need and elevating those voices upwards to the county. One of the reasons this project is so complicated is this is what's happening in that community. This happens every rain, every king tide, every winter. And the one road, which you're seeing on your screen, that goes in and out of the community, it floods. And this is cutting off emergency services. Kids can't get to and from school, and it's already taking a vulnerable community and making things worse. And they are literally already feeling the effects of climate change. And a lot of it is because that wetland has not been properly maintained. So we're working with the County of Marin to put in a brand new culvert connecting that wetland so that it gets really nice tidal flush. We'll be involving the community members in the design process as well as the restoration process, and they get to help decide every aspect of this project. So it doesn't look like much now, but in the next couple of years, this entire wetland will have full tidal function. It's going to be filled with wading birds and sea ducks, and there'll be public access features, and this will be the only green space that the community has access to. All they have is astroturf and cement. So this is a really important project that takes that blueprint's ideas and turns it into action. So if we weren't busy enough, my staff and I, my team of 2 and I, we are already thinking, what do we want to do next? We have some ideas on the horizon, one of which is creating a nesting tern program. The COVID shutdown was really hard on us. We all had to work from home for well over a year. I was very lucky to maintain both of my staff through a round of budget cuts. And that's partially because we stay so busy. So one of the things we noticed when we got back from COVID is we found all along the shoreline, this is a rambaroo, a bunch of tern shells. So we know for the first time in the history of a rambaroo island that Caspian terns nested, which of course we missed it because we were home for a year. So what we did is we tried really quickly to kind of capture that nesting tern colony, but we just missed it for this year. So we wrote a grant, we got some funding, and we're going to be putting up symbolic fencing around that shoreline where the terns nested. We bought a bunch of tern decoys and we bought a sound box, and we're going to make this just the perfect place for terns to nest this next breeding season. So the decoys are on their way. We'll be holding community engagement events to help get them painted, and then we'll be placing sound boxes out on the island to draw those terns in. This year we're ready, and you can see, just to orient you again, there's Lightford House right there. This right here is the whole sanctuary, about the 10.5 acres. And then going off to the right is the larger Richardson Bay. We've also been contracted to work just around the corner from the center. There's a new tidal marsh going in at Blackie's pasture, which was within walking distance of the center. And we'll be leading the community engagement work, getting folks ready for this brand new pebble and sand shoreline, as well as leading the shorebird surveys and the planting efforts. And so we are starting to be known beyond the gates of our center, and other organizations are tapping us for our skill set. So the County of Marin is partnering with us, and my staff will be very, very busy in the coming months counting shorebirds and planting sea blight all along that shoreline. And then during the shutdown, my 2 staff decided to become drone pilots. This is a shot of a Rambaroo Island. The terns we will hopefully have nesting right in the corner over here. To get your drone license, I don't know if anybody on the call has theirs. It's quite a process. You have to go through the FAA, you have to take tests, you have to log your flights, and it's actually a really complicated certification to get. Both my 2 are certified drone pilots, and we're providing drone and photography imagery for lots of projects across the Bay Area now. It helps us with our own work. We can capture the different habitat types on our areas that we've restored, as well as even count water birds. And so we've figured out not quite how to get down to the species, but definitely the type. And it helps us monitor the water bird populations throughout the year. So with that, I should have brought a glass of water with me. I will stop talking and say thank you for inviting me, and I'll go ahead and turn off my screen share and take any questions that you might have.
I'm going to start, Casey. With Audubon, California, how much financial support and also support in the way of academic or volunteer support do you get from Audubon, California?
Good question, and I probably should have said that at the beginning. So our center folds up into Audubon, California, that of course folds up into national. I am responsible for raising my own budget. The budget for the center is right around $400,000, and that's staff, electricity, phone bills, all that good stuff. Because we've been expanding our work portfolio, get a lot of grant support, and that helps me with my bottom line. I also rent 2 of my buildings to an on-site Montessori preschool. There's monthly income coming in that way. And Amar, my community engagement coordinator, they are the volunteer wizard, and they are constantly bringing in volunteers. We actually have the local Rotary Club coming in tomorrow to help us with our garden beds.
Fantastic. Anyone else? You unmute yourself and just ask your question.
I see one in the chat box there. So we are open to the public. We are open Monday through Friday, year round, minus the big holidays. The portion that we close is just the water portion. And so the center grounds, there's a trail that loops the property. We're open almost year round. And so you can visit us anytime. I highly recommend coming in December or January. That's just peak water bird viewing. The herring are spawning. So you have a good chance of catching one of those feeding frenzies.
From is Highway 101, is that the best access to the center?
Yep, Highway 101, and then there's an exit for Tiburon. We're kind of tucked behind a gas station and an apartment complex. So we can be a little fine, but we're there.
Well, I'm going to ask one of the issues we're getting down. We have Morro Bay, which I'm not familiar with that as a birding area. The eelgrass issue is there, and also in Humboldt Bay. Is there any? Is it being solved at all? Is a problem? I know you mentioned the problem of the boats, which I'm assuming with COVID, there's probably more boats than in the past because of homelessness. Is it getting any better or not, the issue with eelgrass?
You know, it's a tough question to answer because eelgrass is such a strange plant. It kind of ebbs and flows in its population size naturally. And so that 840 acres I talked about in 2019, it could be 1,000 acres now, it could be 600 acres, and that could all be natural. Eelgrass is also a really picky plant. It needs perfect salinity, clear water, and shallow bays. So it has to have all these things in order to grow perfectly. And then throw, in our case, a bunch of boats in it, and it can be really detrimental. Eelgrass also doesn't like to be restored. We have not figured out the best way to restore it. Yeah, it's a very tricky plant to restore. It doesn't like to be transplanted. It doesn't like to be moved. So that is an emerging science. The San Francisco State University is really on the forefront of understanding the best way to restore eelgrass, and they do a ton of their experimental plots right within our sanctuary boundaries.
Casey, if we were wanting to come up to visit, is it best to call ahead, make a reservation, or do you show up, or what's the best way to do that?
You know, either or. You can just show up and we will be there. Or if you give me a little bit of notice, I can make sure one of us is there and we'll pull out our scopes. We have several scopes tucked around all over the property. So either way, if you're wanting to come as a group, we can organize a tour and you can meet the staff. You're also welcome just to come as an individual and show up and walk the property. General rule of thumb, if my gates are open, come on in.
I had a question about eelgrass. Is there just one species of that? Is that an angiosperm or is that actually an algae?
Oh, so I will be honest with you. I am not a botanist, so I probably won't be able to answer that. I do know that it's a flowering grass. It's not
okay, so it's an angiosperm. Okay. Okay, is there just one species of it? Or is it multiple species? I just wondered. I can look this up.
No, it's totally fine. There are multiple species across the world, but the population in Richardson Bay and along the flyway is one species.
Thank you.
Now, I mean, real quick, you mentioned the communities nearby. How supportive are they advertise you? I mean, as far as for tourism and all that, Richardson Bay, Tiburon, and Sausalito, etc. How do they look upon you as a neighbor?
Yeah, you know, it probably depends on who you ask. So our direct neighbors that surround the bay that help us with the closure are all very, very supportive. I hear all the time that someone will live just a little further up the hillside, will ride their bike by us and say, I've lived here for 30 years and I didn't know you were here. And so we're definitely kind of a hidden gem to some folks. Our closest neighbors are also our biggest supporters and our biggest donors. But I would say kind of in the Bay Area, we're not very well known. Unless you're a summer camp parent that lives in Tiburon with a 4-year-old, then you know it's very
True. Yeah.
So I have a question, but it's not bird related. It's Hamar related. Do you happen to know if Hamar does anything with John Muir laws, like workshops and things?
Yes, so that was Hamar's brainchild during COVID. We were trying to find ways, one, to basically keep us all employed because we were nervous with the shutdown, and two, just to keep ourselves busy. And that was Hamar's idea. John Muir Laws, before COVID, would host a monthly drawing class at our center in person. When COVID hit, we asked him, what do you think about going virtual? You might get 100 people, something like that. By the end of the series, I think we had engaged over 100,000 people live that took that class. So that's sure. Hamar's idea.
Oh, how, because Hamar is an unusual name for me, at least. I'd only heard it once and then I heard it again and I know up in the area. So how interesting. That's great.
I went to one of Jack's in-person meetings about 2 years ago now. It's a beautiful place.
Yeah,
so glad.
I'm very, very lucky to work there. It's
absolutely.